In the years leading up to the Second World War, armies around the world were trying to understand how war was changing. New machines, new strategies, and new technologies were appearing very quickly. Tanks had become important, aircraft had become important, and the question for many military planners was how to combine both effectively. Armies had infantry, artillery, tanks, and planes, but the challenge was making all of them work together on a battlefield that could move quickly. One of the most interesting and unusual ideas came from the Soviet Union. The idea was simple to describe, but extremely difficult to accomplish: attach wings to a tank, tow it behind an airplane, fly it to the battlefield, release it, glide it down, and then fight immediately once it landed. This idea would eventually lead to an invention known as the A-40 flying tank. To understand why the Soviets even considered this idea, we must look at the problem they were trying to solve. The Soviet Union was a very large country with vast distances between towns, factories, and battlefields. Moving tanks over long distances took time, fuel, and large support systems. Roads were often bad. Many areas had forests, swamps, rivers, and mountains that made transportation very slow. When paratroopers were dropped from planes, they could arrive quickly, but they arrived without armored support. They would land and hold positions, but they could easily be surrounded or attacked by enemy forces with tanks and artillery. The Soviet military wanted a way to get tanks to the paratroopers fast, even if the location had no roads or railways. If they could drop a tank near airborne troops, those troops would have a much better chance of surviving and holding territory. So the basic idea was this: send soldiers by parachute, then send tanks by air. But tanks are heavy, bulky machines made of steel. They are not easy to lift off the ground. To fly something, you need either wings or a very strong engine. The Soviets had transport planes, but they were not strong enough to lift heavy tanks. Even the smallest Soviet light tanks weighed several tons. The idea of simply loading a tank inside a plane was impossible at the time. The tank was too big, the plane was too weak, and even if you could get the tank into the air, landing it safely was nearly impossible. However, engineers and military thinkers did not give up. The Soviet Union had many brilliant engineers, and among them was a man named Oleg Antonov. Antonov was a young but very talented aircraft designer who would later become famous for building some of the biggest airplanes in the world. But at the time of this story, he was still gaining attention. Antonov heard about the idea of transporting tanks by air, and he tried to think about it in a different way. He understood that the tank itself was already very heavy, and trying to design a plane that could lift it was unrealistic. Instead, he wondered, why not make the tank act like part of the airplane? He did not mean adding engines or making the tank fly like a normal aircraft. Instead, he wanted the tank to become a kind of glider. A glider is a flying craft without engines that relies on being pulled into the air and then released. If you could attach wings and a tail to a tank, tow it behind a powerful airplane, release it at the right moment, and glide it down carefully, you could land a tank in the middle of almost any battlefield. Once it landed, the wings could be detached, and the tank could start fighting immediately. It sounded unusual, but it was theoretically possible. Antonov began designing a set of detachable wings and tail structures that could be fixed to one of the Soviet Union's smallest tanks, the T-60. The T-60 was not a large or heavily armored tank. It had thin armor and a relatively small gun. But it was light. And in this situation, lightweight was extremely valuable. If the tank had been heavier, no airplane could tow it into the air at all. The T-60 weighed around 6 tons, and even that was pushing the limits of Soviet aircraft at the time. But it was the best option available. Antonov designed a wooden biplane-style wing structure to attach to the tank. The idea was to keep the design simple and light. The wings were large, stretching out on both sides, and the tail section extended behind the tank to provide stability in the air. The design did not try to turn the tank into a high-performance aircraft. It only needed to glide from the air to the ground. The tank itself would act as the body of the aircraft. The tracks, the turret, and the metal hull would remain untouched. Only the wings and tail were added temporarily. The plan required a strong tow plane to pull the tank into the air. The chosen aircraft was the TB-3, an older but still useful Soviet heavy bomber. The TB-3 had 4 engines, and it was one of the few planes available that might produce enough power to tow the heavy flying tank. Even then, it was a difficult task. The engines of the TB-3 were not extremely powerful, and adding the drag and weight of the flying tank would push them to their absolute limits. Engineers spent a long time building the special wooden wings and tail for the tank. They had to make sure the wings were strong enough to lift the tank off the ground, but not so heavy that the tank became too heavy to tow. They also needed to design the wings so that the pilot inside the tank could control the direction and stability, just like a normal aircraft. This was difficult, because a tank was never meant to be in the air. It had no smooth shape, it was heavy, and it was built to survive bullets, not to glide. But the engineers tried their best to make the wing attachments as light and simple as possible. Once the wings were ready, the next step was to train the pilot. Yes, the tank had a pilot, just like a plane. The pilot would not use airplane controls, but instead special levers and ropes attached to the wings and tail. These controlled the position of the wings, allowing the pilot to steer left or right, climb or descend. The pilot had to learn how to glide the tank safely, how to keep it balanced in the air, and how to land without crashing. When it was time for a test, the tank was prepared by removing any extra weight. The gun was taken off, and most of the heavy ammunition and fuel were removed. The wings and tail were then carefully bolted onto the tank. The tank now looked like a strange mix of machine and glider, the heavy metal body of the tank below, and wide wooden wings stretching out on both sides, with a long tail behind. The tank was placed on the ground on a runway. A long, strong towing cable was attached to the front of the tank and then connected to the back of a large military airplane, the TB-3. This airplane had 4 engines, and it was one of the biggest planes the Soviet Union had at the time. But even it would struggle with the weight of the tank. The TB-3 began moving forward down the runway. At first, both the plane and the tank were just rolling on the ground. The tank did not use its engine or its tracks. It simply rolled forward because the airplane was pulling it. As the plane gained more speed, wind began to flow over the wings attached to the tank. The wings were shaped to create lift, the upward force needed to make something fly. Slowly, the tank began to feel lighter. The faster the airplane went, the more air passed over the wings, and the stronger the lift became. Finally, when the plane reached high enough speed, the tank rose off the ground. It was flying, being pulled through the air behind the plane, like a giant glider. In the air, the pilot inside the tank had to be very focused. The tank did not fly smoothly like a real airplane. It was heavy and difficult to control. The pilot had to constantly adjust the control surfaces, the flaps on the wings and tail, to keep the tank stable. If the tank tilted too far to one side, it could start to spin. If the nose pointed too far down or up, it could lose control. So the pilot had to react quickly and carefully. The plane continued towing the flying tank until it reached the release point, the area where the tank was supposed to glide down and land. When they reached that point, the tow cable was released. The tank was no longer being pulled. Now it was gliding on its own. The tank moved forward and downward at the same time, like a very heavy, very slow airplane. The pilot watched the ground carefully. He needed to choose a flat area to land, a spot without rocks, trees, or other obstacles. As the tank got closer to the ground, the pilot gently pulled on the controls to slow the descent. The tank touched the ground, and its tracks made contact with the earth. The tank rolled forward for a short distance, slowing down naturally. Once the tank had stopped, the pilot would open the hatch and climb out. The wings and tail could be removed by unlocking the attachment points. After that, the tank was back to being a regular tank again. The idea was that, in real combat, it could begin fighting almost immediately after landing. This entire process, attaching wings, towing, flying, gliding, landing, and detaching, was meant to allow tanks to arrive on battlefields where trucks and railways could not go. It was a way to give airborne troops armored support in remote or dangerous areas. The idea worked once in testing, but it was extremely difficult, very risky, and required strong airplanes that the Soviet Union did not have enough of. So even though it was clever and creative, the flying tank was never used in real battles. But the test itself showed that unusual ideas can sometimes work, at least for a moment. The first and only test of the A-40 flying tank took place in 1942. The tank chosen for the test had its gun removed to reduce weight, and most of its fuel and ammunition were also taken out. This was not ideal for real combat, but the goal was just to see if the tank could fly and land safely. The wings were attached carefully, and everything was checked multiple times. The test pilot was a brave and skilled man named Sergei Anakin, who had experience with gliders and experimental aircraft. He climbed inside the tank, which now looked like a strange mix of armored vehicle and large wooden-winged aircraft. The TB-3 taxied down the runway and began to accelerate. It strained under the weight and drag of the tank behind it. The engines were working very hard. At last, the flying tank began to lift off the ground. It rose slowly and unsteadily. The TB-3 struggled to maintain altitude. The test continued, and Anakin worked to keep the tank stable in the air. The controls were difficult, and the flying tank did not handle smoothly. Still, it was flying. The idea was, at least for a moment, working. However, a major problem appeared. The TB-3's engines were overheating. Pulling the tank through the air created too much drag, and the engines were pushed beyond their limits. If the engines overheated too much, the TB-3 could crash. So the crew decided to release the flying tank early, before reaching the planned landing area. The tank glider separated from the tow cable and Anakin guided it downward. The landing was rough, but the tank reached the ground in one piece. Once it stopped moving, Anakin climbed out. The tank had flown and landed successfully. The test proved that the idea was possible. But proving something is possible is not the same as proving it is useful. The test revealed major problems. The biggest issue was the lack of a strong enough towing aircraft. The TB-3 was simply not powerful enough to tow a flying tank in real combat conditions. It barely survived the test. The engines overheated and could have failed. In a battlefield situation, the plane might need to fly fast, avoid enemy fire, or fly longer distances. The TB-3 could not do that while towing a tank. The Soviet Union did not have larger or stronger aircraft at the time that could solve this problem. And building such aircraft would take years. Another issue was the preparation time. Attaching the wings to the tank required effort, tools, and space. It could not be done quickly on the front lines. And once the tank landed, someone had to detach the wings before it could fight. If the enemy was nearby, there would be no time for this. The flying tank concept required a perfect situation to work. Real battles are rarely perfect. There was also the matter of the tank itself. The T-60 was light, but it was also lightly armored and had a small gun. In combat, it could be easily destroyed by stronger enemy tanks. If the flying tank had been heavier and stronger, it would have been much more useful, but then it would have been too heavy to fly. The idea was trapped between two limits: a light tank was flyable but weak, and a strong tank was powerful but too heavy to tow. Even though the A-40 flying tank technically worked, it was not practical. After the test, the Soviet military understood that they could not put the idea into regular use. The concept was archived, and resources were directed toward more traditional methods of tank transport. Later in the war, countries including the United States and Germany used large cargo planes and gliders to transport vehicles like jeeps or very small tanks, but none tried again to make a tank itself fly. The A-40 remained the only attempt to turn a tank into a glider. However, the idea was not wasted. It showed how far military planners were willing to go to solve difficult problems. It also showed how innovation can appear in unexpected forms. The dream of combining airborne troops and armored vehicles continued, even if the flying tank itself did not become a practical solution. After the war, new aircraft designs became stronger, and the development of helicopters provided a different way to move armored vehicles quickly. Today, some light armored vehicles can be carried by large helicopters. This solves the same problem with different technology. Oleg Antonov, the engineer behind the flying tank, continued his career and became one of the most important aircraft designers in Soviet history. His design bureau built Oleg Antonov, the engineer behind the flying tank, continued his career and became one of the most important aircraft designers in Soviet history. His design bureau built many famous aircraft, including some of the largest cargo planes ever made. The lesson he learned from the flying tank experiment helped guide his later work. He understood the importance of balancing weight, power, and purpose. A machine is only useful if it can perform its task reliably and safely. The flying tank reminded him that ideas must be matched with realistic technology. The A-40 became remembered as one of the most unusual experiments in the history of military aviation. It was not a failure in the sense that it did not work at all. The prototype flew, landed, and the pilot survived. But it was a solution to a problem using technology that was simply not yet ready. If more powerful aircraft engines had existed at the time, the flying tank might have become more than a single test. But history moves at the speed of invention, and some ideas arrive before the world has the tools to make them practical. Although the flying tank was never used in combat, it remains a symbol of human creativity during a time of intense pressure and necessity. War often forces rapid innovation. Some ideas succeed and change the world. Others are tested once and then set aside. The A-40 belongs to the second category. It is interesting not because it changed the outcome of battles, but because it shows how people think when facing difficult challenges. It was an attempt to do something that had never been done before, and for a brief moment, it succeeded in the air. People sometimes imagine the flying tank as a strange or humorous invention, and it does look unusual in pictures. A tank with wings attached to it appears almost like something from a fictional story. But behind its unusual appearance was a serious purpose. The designers and pilots were not trying to amuse anyone. They were trying to solve the real and urgent problem of transporting armored vehicles across difficult terrain. The flying tank was not a joke. It was a real military experiment conducted by serious engineers and soldiers. Looking back, the idea also teaches something about how technology grows. Innovation is rarely a straight path. Many experiments are necessary to learn what is possible and what is not. Every idea that does not become adopted still adds to human understanding. The flying tank showed the limits of aircraft power at the time. It demonstrated that if militaries wanted to transport tanks by air, they needed either lighter tanks, stronger engines, or new ways of landing vehicles safely. Over the decades that followed, engineers worked on all three of those directions. Helicopters became strong enough to lift armored vehicles. Cargo planes became large enough to carry tanks inside them. And new kinds of lightweight armor were invented. The flying tank played a small role in pushing those developments forward. The story of the flying tank also helps us understand the environment of the Second World War. Nations were under intense pressure to find every possible advantage. Battles were fought across large areas, and speed was often the key to victory. A weapon that could appear suddenly, without needing roads, could have changed the way battles were fought. The Soviet Union was willing to explore bold and unconventional ideas because war demanded every possible advantage. Even if the flying tank did not become widely used, it reflected the determination to try everything. The pilot who flew the tank, Sergei Anakin, became recognized for his bravery and skill. Piloting a glider is already difficult. Piloting a tank with wings, which had never been flown before, required confidence, steady nerves, and precise control. His safe landing showed that the concept was not only theoretically possible but also practically manageable. It demonstrated the remarkable skill of Soviet test pilots at the time. Many experiments in aviation rely on pilots taking personal risks, and Anakin's role is a reminder of the human courage behind technological progress. In later years, historians looked back on the A-40 and often included it in lists of strange inventions. Some described it as an example of desperation. Others described it as an example of creativity. The truth lies between these descriptions. The flying tank was not foolish, and it was not pointless. It was a practical solution attempted with the technology available, but it reached the limit of what that technology could deliver. It was reasonable to try but not reasonable to continue once the results became clear. The flying tank stands today as a rare piece of military history where ambition exceeded capability. Yet it is also a testament to the spirit of innovation. It reminds us that progress often comes from trying ideas that may not work. The willingness to experiment, even with difficult or unusual concepts, is what leads humanity forward. The A-40 did not become a standard military vehicle. It did not reshape warfare. But it proved something important: sometimes the only way to learn what is possible is to try. The story of the flying tank remains recorded in museums, historical writings, and aviation archives. Models and drawings of it continue to attract attention from those who study military history or engineering. It encourages people to look at problems from different angles. Instead of asking how to build a bigger plane, Antonov asked how to make the tank lighter and more aerodynamic. This kind of thinking is valuable far beyond the battlefield. It is the type of thinking that leads to breakthroughs in all fields. In the end, the flying tank was used only once. But that one flight was enough to prove its point. It showed that even a heavy machine like a tank could glide through the air if equipped with the right structures and guided by a skilled pilot. It also revealed the limits of the towing aircraft and the difficulties of using such a system reliably. The experiment ended because the world was not yet ready for such a machine. Technology would have to advance much further before airborne armored support could become common. Today, armies use helicopters and large cargo aircraft to move armored vehicles quickly. These technologies did not exist at the time of the flying tank. But the idea behind the A-40 remains the same: soldiers on the ground should not have to wait long for support. Speed matters. Mobility matters. The challenge of bringing armored power to remote locations is still important. The tools have changed, but the goal remains similar. The flying tank remains a story of imagination, effort, and the search for solutions beyond ordinary thinking. It belonged to a time when the world was changing rapidly and when every idea, no matter how strange, deserved consideration if it could help. It may never have reached the battlefield, but it flew once, and that was enough to place it permanently in the long and surprising history of human innovation.